For the power of truth, this is the Glad Report.
The Movement for Multi-Party Democracy, Mmd Vs Zambian Economy, the Hour for New Hope. I'm glad reporting to you. In 1991, Chilova, the leader of Mmd, secured 76% of the vote, beating UNIP's Kawunda. He was presented with statistics. The Priority Survey, one of the World Banks, stated that 61% of Zambia's population was dubbed extremely poor. 78% of that 61 coming from the rural population. He thought to himself, so if my neighbors can't help me, Angola, Mozambique still entertaining Cold War parties, and to the south you have Zimbabwe's inflation shooting over the roofs, how can they possibly help us without inflation over 100%? So you think if your friends can't help you, you go to mommy and daddy for help. Mommy and daddy being the World Bank and IMF. World Bank and IMF 1992, they began their reforms. So reforms, they began to counter, how could we counter inflation? How could we counter the fiscal deficits? How could we counter the unemployment? How could we also possibly counter the lack of corporate revenue? So you start to think, okay, we take out the subsidies out of mealie meal, which is just, to liberalize the agricultural policies. And then also we have seen a shift in monetary policy, where I have the Bank of Zambia handing over its power to a treasury bill auction to really, give it the power to determine bank lending rates, interest rates, and all that. Then also a change in fiscal policy. In 1994, ZRA was established, and then in the years to follow, they were switched from sales tax to value-added tax on consumers. And then, just a change in, the general policies of the country. And then with privatization taking its course now, because really what was presented to free the parastatals of all the losses that they had incurred over the years, because with the government being in charge of parastatals, really it was really, more like domino effects really, because if one parastatal fails, the government wants to save it and use another parastatal's money to fix the other one. So really just to free them from that cycle, they decided to privatize. A few were liquidized really. That Hobson's choice. Liquidized, you'd have the Zambia Airways in 1994 was fully liquidized, and that had turned into a story of the past now. And then in 1992, Zambia Privatization Act is taken, and now privatization is not a serious thing. And then you have the Zambia Privatization Agency, which really was championed for transparency and all that. So it was a wonderful organization. And 1996, just before the privatization of the copper mines began, the Zambia privatization really was dubbed the most successful privatization on the continent by the World Bank. It was actually, very beautiful to watch. Though at the time, Zambia was still quite dependent on external financial assistance, still incurring a lot of debt. So 1996, ZCCM is now, being broken apart. And this is where privatization really became a hot potato. I think people are talking about all the time. The public was really, more wary of what's really going on. The Luanshya mines, people said, oh, there were pre-selected bidders when picking the buyers for the mines, and looting ministers and all that talk behind it, a lot of rumors around it. Sadly, Zambia was in a very weak bargaining position with the low prospect of the copper prices rising. It was just, it also made it the buyers were like, oh, have you seen the copper prices? They haven't been good for the past 20 years. What makes you think they're going to become better in the years to come? And then also you have Zambia, and then also there was the backlog to clear of all those unpaid things. And then they're telling you also, we need to put investment into this to make this business continue. So it just made things much, much, much harder in terms of, Zambia's bargaining position. So the mines were sold very cheaply. And then also, so the average citizen also benefited very little, even much, much less, because of the corruption. And, just the murky backdrop, the dustiness, the cloudiness, very hard to, monitor. And sadly, so even today, I'm speaking almost 20 years later, even 20, 25 years later, very little post-evaluation on the privatization activities of Zambia are on paper, at least in papers I found. They literally stated that very little investigations were done on how it was conducted. Anyway, so privatization completed. But you might ask, why was the IMF and the World Bank implementing such measures onto the African continent? Because Zambia wasn't the only one. Really, arguably, the most influential economist of the second half of the 20th century was Milton Friedman, a free marketeer, a free market capitalist, 1976 Nobel Prize winner in economic sciences. This is a man who was quoted saying, if you put the federal government in charge of the Sahara Desert, in 5 years, they will be shredded of sand. I mean, or at least words to that effect. I mean, so this is his thinking, really. And he was really the brains behind Reaganomics, like, countering all that stagflation in America, stagnation and inflation, similar to Zambia also. And then you also have Thatcherism by Margaret Thatcher in England, which is really fundamentally was just telling governments to get out of the way, which is really on paper anti-socialist. So they were implementing these things because in the West, when something happens in the West, the rest of the world follows suit. So here in Africa, you have, so socialism being kicked out the door, and it's now, let capitalism take its course for those of you that didn't have capitalism initially. So Zambia was now democratic capitalism. Really, it was actually successful. Mommy and Daddy also put us on a naughty list of 39 countries, of highly indebted poor countries, HIPC. 2000 we joined it, and after reaching completion points, 2005, our debt was forgiven, and Zambia's kwacha immediately started to appreciate. So things started to actually look very pretty. Inflation now actually became single digit. Poverty had now dropped. 1996, 2006, there was a 10% total drop over those years. Just looking very, very pretty, really. But a lot of sad things also started to happen. Unemployment became a problem, with also urbanization, people moving from rural-urban migration, because the rural population kept decreasing and people were migrating because of the government's focus on urban population. Perhaps should have implemented something like Ujama in Tanzania, which didn't actually work out with his policy of moving people from urban to rural, but didn't work out. But anyway, on paper maybe. But just a lot of, so unemployment started to rise, and then from post-2006, poverty rates were statistically insignificant reductions or improvements, so no changes really. And just, just a sense of unhappiness maybe grew in the Zambian population, the Zambian psyche. It was really just time for government to change after the 20-year rule of Mmd. Yes, it was marred in a lot of corruption, but was dubbed the most successful on the continent, most successful reformers on the continent, dubbed by the World Bank. When they decided to issue bonds in 2011, when the government decided to issue bonds in 2011, the first one was 16 times oversubscribed. That should tell you about the reputation of Zambia at the time. It's actually booming. A pathetic excuse I saw in one paper that I looked at, explaining Zambia's poverty, said that Zambia, the reason it didn't handle fiscal resources properly is because after experiencing a 30-year fiscal crisis, it didn't have a finance ministry. I was like, okay. Anyway, there's a lot of corruption in the equation, but Mmd, most successful reformers, dubbed. So actually they were in good books with the outside onlookers. It was actually quite pretty for Zambia, but with all that investor confidence, Fitch, Standard and Poor's, part of the big three lending agencies, the big ones, they tell us that Zambia lending rating was B+. So actually, it's actually looking very pretty. So Zambia, with all that confidence from the external world, great reputation, it's no surprise that all that confidence is put into getting a lot of Nkongole. So it's not surprising to see what we're experiencing today. But Mmd versus Zambian economy, it seemed Mmd was also just, lucky with a lot of external factors. Copper prices recovered in 2003, and also debt being forgiven. So it was lucky in that sense, but most successful economic reformers on the continent. I'm obliged to you for hearing me. I'm glad with the report.
For the power of truth, this is the Glad Report.